Squad, it's your girl Natasha coming at you with another episode of Crime Squad podcast. If you're just joining for the first time, welcome. If you're already part of the squad, thanks for coming back. This podcast features Canadian true crime cases, both solved and unsolved, and is produced completely by yours truly. If this sounds like your cup of tea, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. If you're already subscribed, a rating would go a long way. I really appreciate the support. This episode of Crime Squad podcast is a case from the 90s, and it's still unsolved to this very day. The family still holds on to hope that one day their loved one will be found and they'll finally know what happened to her. The family went through a lot with this case, and there are some definite twists and turns. This is the case of Mistie Murray. Let's get into it. Do you remember being a teenager? I do. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, and other days it seems like just yesterday I was freaking out over a huge pimple or whether or not the boy in class that I liked me back. Teens face so many challenges. Puberty is a big one, a time where hormones run crazy and make life confusing as hell. And there's also the stress of what happens after high school. Is college an option? University? A job? So many decisions to be made, and you're expected to know what you want to be when you grow up so early in life. You have to take the right courses in school, after all, to be accepted to post-secondary education if that's the route you're going. Add in a healthy dash of trying to establish who you are as a person, and it's a perfect recipe for conflict with parental units or guardians. With the advancement of technology and the internet, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a teen today. I definitely had my fair share of issues at home in my youth, and there were many times where I fantasized about running away. The problem with fantasizing is that fantasies are not reality. I'd get as far as packing some things in a backpack while trying to hold back angry tears, but then I'd realize I really had nowhere to go. No money, no food. What did I plan on doing once I left? Some fantasies involved jumping on train cars and riding them to a new destination where I could start fresh. In others, I imagined somehow buying a plane ticket to San Francisco and living on the streets on Haight and Ashbury. Running away is the most common reason an adolescent goes missing. Often, a teen who runs away makes this decision because of personal problems, family issues, or external influences, like maybe a new friend group or a new love interest. It's often a tactic used after conflict of some kind, whether it's between friends or family members and the teen. Thankfully, many teens who run away are often found or returned to their homes, but there are some who are never seen again. I have seen so many cases where someone reports their teenage child missing and police assume it's just a runaway situation. But I've always wondered, how many of these cases weren't actually because a teen ran away? What makes the police so sure there wasn't foul play leading to their disappearance? Jean Marie Oldfield was born on October 28, 1978 in Nova Scotia to Darlene Oldfield. Darlene struggled in caring for Jean Marie because by 1980, Darlene gave Jean Marie up for adoption. Jean Marie was only 2 years old, but had already experienced a turbulent upbringing. One can only guess as to what her life may have been like, but her biological mother made the decision to try and offer Jean Marie a better life with a family who could properly care for her. After spending a few years in foster care, which obviously has its own unique challenges, Jean Marie met Anne and Stephen Murray, a couple from Ontario. They fell in love with the little girl and made the decision to adopt her. In 1983, Jean Marie Oldfield was given the name Mistie Nicole Murray by her new family, and she was welcomed with open arms into a loving home. She was nearly 5 years old. Living with her new parents offered a stable environment in which to blossom and grow, and by all accounts, Misty did just that. It wasn't without challenges, though, which is absolutely to be expected based on the instability of her first formative years. The Murrays, though, were well equipped with love and patience, and Anne Murray actually was trained as a teacher, so she specifically worked with children who had learning disabilities, which sometimes includes emotional outbursts. Anne's memories of the early days with Misty paint a difficult transition for Misty and family. Misty often had horrific nightmares and was prone to uncontrollable sobbing at times. She was preoccupied with what she had done wrong to have her foster family get rid of her. She was only 5 years old. This is so tragic in and of itself, and it really shows just how children can be shaped in their formative years in a negative way. Trauma is a horrible thing for anyone, but for children, it can cause a ton of long-standing effects that are so challenging to overcome. Anne and Stephen had no idea how distraught a small child could be, but they saw that in Misty, and they worked at loving her and trying to make her feel safe, secure, and part of their family. Looking back now, Anne believes Misty suffered from an attachment disorder. Children with attachment disorders may have been physically or emotionally abused or neglected. Attachment disorders can also form because of a child being in foster care or an orphanage. The long-term impact can affect a person physically, emotionally, and socially. Anne believes Misty was impacted by attachment issues because of her disinhibition when it came to strangers. Misty was not at all shy to meet new people, even to the point where she would actively pursue strangers, male or female, to engage in conversation. If they were sitting, she might try to sit on their lap. She would speak to them and even ask if she could live with them. Now, this is obviously when Misty was a young child, and typically the behavior that you see in young children is when they're in the company of strangers, they tend to be a little bit uncomfortable and they tend to cling to their caregivers. And obviously, that was not the case with Misty. And this actually does align to something called disinhibited social engagement disorder. But, I mean, this is obviously pure speculation because Misty was never actually diagnosed with this. Life did go on for the family, and they ended up in the super small town of St. Columban in Ontario, which I honestly had never even heard of until I started researching this case. Not that that really means much of anything, because there are so many small little towns or municipalities that exist, even in just a 2-hour radius from my own city. And these are towns so small that you could blink and you'd be through them. When Misty was 14 and starting her second semester of grade 9, the family wanted to change and move to Goderich, Ontario, which was about a 40-minute drive from St. Columban. This meant Misty would be starting at a new school, and for some kids, that may not adjust well to the big change, but for Misty, she quickly gained herself a good reputation. She was seen as a free-spirited person and the kind of person that was a true friend to many. She also did well in school, although her parents did notice a change when she turned 13. Now, I think this is natural. The urge to rebel definitely increases when the hormones start flowing. Photographs of Misty show a pretty young woman with a wide smile. She has a gap in between her 2 front teeth, which makes her appearance unique and charming. She has auburn hair, which she wore short, and it looks like it has an unruly curl to it. She also has almond-shaped eyes, which are described as gray-green. She looks like a normal kid of the times, fresh-faced and ready to find something fun to do. I'm sure by now, though, you know something happened to Misty. You are listening to a true crime podcast after all. And yes, something did happen, I can confirm that. The thing is, though, I have no idea what happened. And neither do Misty's family, friends, and seemingly the police. For nearly 30 years, there have been no answers to the question that remains on everyone's lips. Where is Mistie Murray? Right off the bat, I just feel that there are so many odd things that are surrounding Misty's disappearance. I know the police initially probably believed Misty was a runaway, but there are items left behind that a runaway would definitely not leave behind. And there were sightings of Misty that unfortunately weren't properly followed up on. And there were also rumors of Misty being involved in drugs and prostitution. So to go back to 1995, May 31st, Misty woke up and got dressed for school. She donned red shorts, black boots, a ring on every finger, and according to some sources, a nylon green jacket with her name Misty embroidered on one arm and the initials of the school marching band she belonged to on the other arm. Misty went to school that day, and there are two pieces of information of interest that happened on that school day. One, Misty apparently visited the school nurse in the late afternoon, but the reason for this was never disclosed. Two, Misty called her mother at work after her visit to the school nurse, but her mother didn't answer the phone and Misty didn't leave a voicemail. This was the last confirmed attempt Misty made to contact her family, and it was confirmed by police that she was not sighted again after this day. Now, I say confirmed by police, and we'll get into some more details later, and really, there could be nothing to this story at all. I mean, if Misty went to the school nurse because she wasn't feeling well and then called her mom to see if she had permission to leave school, that could very well be the case. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything suspicious about this. And I know there's some speculation on the internet from people saying, maybe she went to the school nurse because she was pregnant. But, obviously that's never been proven. It's just a point of interest in the case that sort of kicked everything off. And it's not as if someone can just vanish into thin air, right? So where did Misty go? One of Misty's best friends was named Danielle. Though they just met the same year Misty turned 16, they bonded quickly. And I believe it. Some of the best friendships I have were forged in the unsure years of adolescence. I don't know if I've ever had a connection in my adult life like I did with the friends I made at that age. The girls like to do normal small-town teenage things of the times. For all of our young listeners, the 90s, they were a time where smartphones and social media didn't exist. So you'd spend your time at the mall, driving around the streets, or dare I say, bicycling around trying to find friends to hang out with for the day. Misty and Danielle liked to play pool. They hung out at Goderich's small downtown core, and they would go window shopping, and they would also cruise around. They would sit at the pier and watch the vessels come in while eating fish and chips. Like teens tend to do, they imagined their futures, and it became a great conversation topic. Their plan was like the plans I made with my school-age best friend. Graduate high school, get an apartment together, enroll in the same college, and then make it big. They would be successful career women, even though they hadn't yet figured out what careers that they would pursue. But see, it didn't matter. Because the excitement of the conversation was more about exploring life together, getting the hell out of their small town lives, and making something of themselves. It didn't matter how they did it, just that they did it. Perhaps these hopes and dreams offered comfort in the face of adversity. After all, at 16, Danielle was pregnant, and the child's father wasn't planning on being part of a happy little family, preferring instead to leave Danielle as a single mother. And Misty was experimenting and testing boundaries by hanging out with what most parents would refer to as the wrong kinds of people. Sometimes she'd stay out all night. She began hanging in the company of kids who did drugs and skipped school and started fighting with her parents about her curfew, believing she should have more freedom. In and of itself, again, this is pretty normal behavior for a teen, at least in my experience. But we also have to factor in the impact Misty's early life may have had on her. After all, she was born into instability with a mother who moved her around a lot and even ended up on the streets at one point. Finally, she gave Misty up so another family could adopt her and hopefully provide what her bio mom couldn't. And Misty didn't have hatred towards her bio mom, though. She appreciated everything her parents, Anne and Steve Murray, did for her, but there was a nagging itch that needed to be scratched for Misty, and that was the idea of finding and meeting her biological family. When Misty was beginning to venture into uncharted territory with a new group of friends and her grades started to slip, Anne wanted to do everything she could to help her daughter overcome this challenging time. She thought that perhaps it was time to find Mistie's bio mom and set up a meeting between the two. Mistie was elated at the idea of meeting her flesh and blood. In October of 1994, Mistie met Darlene Oldfield, the woman who brought her into the world. The two would hit it off, and then they would begin to plan a trip to Halifax, Nova Scotia, so Mistie could meet the rest of her biological family. The trip was supposed to happen the weekend of June 2nd. Mistie had carefully packed her suitcase days before the trip and was really looking forward to traveling. She'd even saved up $200 for the trip, which was sitting on her dresser waiting for her for when the weekend rolled around. And yet, despite these exciting upcoming plans, it was May 31st when Mistie was last seen. She was reported officially missing June 2nd, 1995. As mentioned, initial police involvement labeled Mistie as a runaway. But if you were going to run away, why in the hell would you leave $200 on your dresser? That money would have been essential to any kind of runaway plan. As time progressed, though, and there was no sign of Mistie, police were hard-pressed to generate any theories or leads. That is, of course, until September of 1995, when a likely suspect was arrested and charged with her murder. And the culprit was none other than her adoptive father, Stephen Murray. Have you ever heard of Occam's razor? It's a philosophical problem-solving principle that, in simple terms, means that if there are multiple explanations as to why an incident or situation has occurred, the simplest explanation is the right one. Okay, I'll explain it like this. If you have a headache, is it more likely that you're dehydrated or that you have a brain tumor? Murders by strangers, especially in a small town, are not likely to happen. But the murder of a child by a parent is far more likely, and this is why police focused on Stephen Murray. What led them to their arrest? That is the question. Well, as far as I can tell, police zeroed in on him as a suspect because during his initial questioning on the day Mistie disappeared, Stephen had forgotten to mention he had taken a 15-minute boat ride on his speedboat in the harbor that evening. This and this alone made the police begin searching the waterways in Lake Huron for Mistie's body, but nothing was ever found. Stephen's boat was impounded, and the town was left in absolute shock that the father of the missing girl had been arrested for her murder. Those who really knew Mistie, though, they didn't buy it. They recall Mistie being so fond of her parents and never speaking bad about them at all. In fact, Stephen had just purchased a brand new Trans Am convertible, and Mistie was so proud of her father for making that purchase. She couldn't wait to be able to drive it when she got her driver's license, and that was also something that was coming up, a big milestone. It just didn't seem to add up, but police put their blinders on and truly believed the simplest explanation was the best one. Stephen had killed Mistie and dumped her body. Never mind the motive. And despite Stephen really not displaying any kind of violent tendency, this seemed the only explanation. Stephen was well known in the small community the Murrays called home. He was actively involved in the school system as a school trustee, and he was president of the Parent-Teacher Association. He was head of the Soccer Association. But as us true crime buffs know, squad, standing in the community and outward appearances truly do mean nothing when it comes to someone's ability to commit a horrific crime. Obviously, the police had evidence, right? Police have to have evidence to charge someone with a crime, right? This can be considered widely debated, but in the case of Mistie Murray, nothing is clear-cut. Before we get into the theory of Stephen's guilt, let's look at some of the other things that came up in the course of the investigation. First, there were numerous sightings of Mistie after May 31st, the day she was supposedly killed by Stephen. One of the witnesses was a girl named Sarah, who knew Mistie from high school. She claims to have seen Mistie on June 1st, the day after she went missing, and Mistie had mentioned something about going driving in Clinton, Ontario with friends. Another student told Anne and Stephen Murray they'd seen Mistie on June 2nd. The police had other ideas, though, and these sightings were not followed up on. Police simply had it locked in their minds that Mistie was dead. And after only a day-long search when she was reported missing, they began to instead focus on the case as a homicide. Spoiler alert, the police were later put under investigation for their conduct in the Mistie Murray disappearance. So rather than dance around the issue, I'm going to illustrate the concerns as penned by lawyer Gordon Cudmore on May 2nd, 2001, which I was able to find thanks to the Internet Archival tool, the Wayback Machine. First things first, the obvious. Goderich police were not equipped to deal with a case of this magnitude. They did not have the proper training or tools and therefore should have passed the case on to the Ontario Provincial Police Service immediately to ensure the investigation was conducted properly. Numerous sightings of Mistie were reported, however, these tips were not acted on. Because of this, critical information was lost. There were no interviews conducted and no follow-up investigation. I'm not a detective by any means. I like to think that I am, but I'm more of an armchair sleuth. The first thing to do, though, when someone goes missing is to trace their steps and work your way through the last movements of their day. Is that not obvious? I mean, truly, if it's not an obvious action to take, I welcome feedback. Feel free to leave me a comment on social media. If you're in agreement, though, that you'd want to search the areas where the missing person was last seen, then you'll be as miffed as I am to find out the police did not canvass, search, or conduct interviews in the areas where Mistie was last seen. Clues only last so long, and that was a huge missed opportunity. I'm not saying they would have found a clue, but we don't know what we don't know. And the fact that Mistie is still missing after all this time, I'll let that speak for itself. Cudmore goes on to indicate that there was a complete lack of case management, meaning that information received did not have a plan for processing. There was no triage of the relevance or importance of information, which means nothing could be prioritized, and interviews were not completed in a timely manner, which of course can mean memories are tainted and information is forever lost. For some reason, in late June 1995, Goderich Police Chief at the time, Chief Russell Phillips, shut down the missing person investigation. Not even a month after Mistie was reported missing. This also was against the advice of provincial law enforcement, as well as a well-known advocacy organization for missing children, which was called Child Find. So to be clear, against the advice of a larger police body and an organization dedicated to providing assistance to locate missing children and then provide families with support, Goderich Police shut down the investigation into Mistie's disappearance, which meant that for a whole month, which is crucial time in a disappearance, the case sat dormant. By the time Goderich Police Service wrote a formal request to ask the Ontario Provincial Police to step in and assist, valuable information and clues would be lost. Something interesting that I came across also was that Mistie's fingerprints were never taken from her home or personal possessions. This boggles my mind when you think about exactly what a disadvantage this is. What police did do was set up a Mistie Murray hotline, and this allowed members of the public to call a specific phone number if they felt they had information that could be relevant to the case. Each call was recorded on answering machines, and back in the day, again, for younger listeners, in answering machines, which were separate from the phone itself, they had these little tiny mini audio cassette tapes. And so that's what these were recorded on. Instead of being archived, though, in evidence, police destroyed these tapes, which is odd, and I'm guessing not legal, because technically this would be tampering with evidence. And to be honest, while researching this case, I actually started to wonder if maybe someone from the police force was guilty of something to do with Mistie's disappearance. This is really based on nothing except my overactive imagination and a love of some drama, but it does seem odd that so many fumbles were made here. It's almost comical. It seems very evasive. Again, this is not rooted in any kind of fact. I Can't even say, though, that the police efforts in arresting and charging Stephen Murray were successful, though, either. Because once it finally went to trial, after only 45 minutes of deliberation by the jury, he was found not guilty. So again, we go back to, how did Stephen Murray get off on the murder of Mistie Murray if there was evidence pointing to Stephen being the culprit? The thing is, there wasn't really evidence at all. The only evidence police felt linked Stephen to the crime was circumstantial at best. When Stephen was initially interviewed, he had forgotten to mention he had taken a ride on his boat the same day Mr. Yu was officially last seen. So that was something that police thought was suspicious. And when Stephen was asked about this, he defended himself on this point because he said that he didn't think this information was of relevance. And at that time, his mind was going a mile a minute trying to figure out where Misty was. Even if that sounds fishy, sounding suspicious does not a murderer make. The other piece of evidence was from two witnesses who claimed they saw Stephen on his boat with a young teenager that might have been Misty, and they said that that day the harbor was completely deserted. Now, somehow it took 4 months for police to confirm the witness account was actually invalid. The harbor was very busy that day. There were tons of boats in the water, and there was a huge vessel at port. And I mean huge because it was a salt vessel. Why did it take so long for police to debunk this? I have no idea. That's what we're working with here. This also brings up another layer of potential suspects in Misty's disappearance. Apparently, sailors would often come on shore in Goderich, and they would get drunk and get food and whatever before boarding again for a long stint of sea travel. Some said that the sailors could be rowdy. So maybe, based again on nothing but pure speculation, Misty, who was prone to talking to strangers and was in a phase of rebelliousness, decided to go along with a group. I don't believe police ever obtained a list of the seamen on board either, not even to conduct criminal checks. It was May 15th, 1997 that Stephen was finally acquitted, which was great for Stephen's name. Well, sort of. This isn't the kind of thing you can just bounce back from. People talk, people gossip. A tarnished reputation may never be that shining star it once was, no matter how respected you are in a community. Also, it didn't help that police were quoted multiple times in the media as being in disbelief that Stephen Murray essentially got off on what they still believed was a murder. Taxpayer dollars were funneled into continuous attempts to locate Misty's body in Lake Huron, but nothing ever surfaced. The ramifications of all of this seemed to be boundless. There was not just the emotional and physical stress, but the financial strain was also enormous. The Murrays had an extensive legal bill, nearly $500,000, and it had to be paid. To do so, the couple had to sell their tavern and cash in their investments. So what were they left with in the end? Anne and Stephen filed suit against the police department, saying there was misconduct that directly prevented a thorough investigation into Misty's case. Their assertions were reviewed and then endorsed by the Ontario Civilian Commission on Police Service, which acted as an independent and unbiased review of police conduct. When Mistie Murray's case was reviewed, the panel agreed there were definite shortcomings and errors in judgment with the police investigation, leading to Stephen's arrest, and then, sadly, him being pursued continuously by police even after he was acquitted. Panel members agreed there was a complete lack of sensitivity by individual officers, conduct which was not aligned to the Police Services Act. Despite all of this, the civilian agency didn't lay charges related to misconduct. And this wasn't necessarily because there wasn't justification to lay these charges. But over the last 6 years that had passed between Misty's disappearance and this review, several key members of the investigation had since retired and therefore could not be charged. The Goderich Police Service was eventually disbanded and merged with the Ontario Provincial Police Service. So after all of this, to look at what remains, Stephen's life after the arrest was basically doomed, at least in Goderich and surrounding area. Eventually, he and Anne divorced. He longed for solitude and became a long-haul truck driver, spending most of his days alone on a big rig, traveling long distances. He never forgot Mistie, though, and would hope that he would one day come across her again. He actually had a massive decal of Mistie's missing poster on the back of his trailer in the hopes that someone somewhere would come forward someday with information. He did eventually remarry and relocated to North Bay, where he later died in 2018 at the age of 68. And where did Mistie wind up? Would she be around today if police hadn't focused so much on pursuing Stephen? And what information could have changed things anyway? Well, believe it or not, there were several leads that could have potentially led the case in a different direction entirely. Remember Mistie's friend Danielle? A couple of days before Mistie vanished without a trace, there was a funeral for one of the students at school who had tragically died in a plane crash. Mistie and Danielle attended the funeral, and this was where Danielle introduced Mistie to Jeremy Cook, an 18-year-old who was also attending the funeral. It's unclear how Danielle knew him, but Mistie was very taken with him from the get-go. Even though they had just met, a few days later, Mistie would refer to Jeremy as her boyfriend. On May 29th, Danielle and Mistie went to Jeremy's apartment to drink beer and hang out. Despite introducing Jeremy to Mistie, Danielle actually didn't think much of him herself. He was quick to get on her nerves, and she didn't like the things he bragged about, like drugs, as well as his collection of hunting knives. Danielle's intuition would tell her Jeremy made her feel uneasy, and so for some reason, she left Mistie in his company and headed home. A day later, on May 30th, Danielle called Mistie because she wanted a pair of shorts Mistie had borrowed from her the weekend prior. Mistie seemed excited during the phone call and told Danielle there was someone she wanted Danielle to meet. She wouldn't reveal anything else about this mystery person, and in any case, Danielle had to reschedule their plans anyway to grab the shorts, so she didn't end up showing up. Mistie reportedly spent the day at Jeremy's and left his place around 5 that evening. The thing is, though, Mistie didn't end up meeting with Danielle to drop off the shorts the next day as they had planned. They also had a farewell dinner they were going to attend together, something they'd planned before Mistie would go visit the Bio family in Halifax, and Mistie didn't show up for that. Concerned, because this was totally unlike Mistie, Danielle told Anne Murray the truth about where Mistie was. She admitted to Anne that she and Mistie had concocted a story about having band practice so Mistie could visit with Jeremy. Anne and Danielle decided to go right to Jeremy's house, but when they got there, Jeremy refused to let them in. He blocked the door also, which obstructed any view inside his apartment unit. Jeremy was a suspect for a time, but this seems to have gone to the wayside once Stephen was arrested. No further information is available on Jeremy Cook's presence in the case, whether he was involved or not involved in Mistie's being gone. All of that aside, though, perhaps one of the most difficult and intriguing things about this case, which caused Anne and Stephen to actually pursue their own search operations, were the various sightings of Mistie after May 31st, 1995. There are two schools of thought on this. On one hand, the Ontario Provincial Police media about Mistie Murray indicates there have been no credible sightings of Mistie after May 31st, 1995. But I'm not sure what their definition of credible is in this context. Why? Well, it came out in court during Stephen's trial that in actuality, police had received almost 100 tips from people who had seen a female matching Mistie's description. But none of these tips were reviewed by police because police were so intent that their theory of Mistie being murdered was the right one. Believe what you will, But as mentioned earlier in the episode, Mistie, who was fragile emotionally to begin with thanks to her traumatic formative years, seemed to be going through a rebellious phase. In addition to being a bit of a rebel, like hanging with kids who did drugs, drinking alcohol, and smoking cigarettes, she had something that made this a potentially lethal combination. She was trusting of just about anyone and wasn't wary at all about strangers. It wasn't just one person who said they saw Mistie after May 31st. There were 10. Yes, 10 independent witnesses who reported seeing Mistie after May 31st. 2 were students who knew Mistie and said they saw her June 2nd in the nearby town of Clinton, seemingly waiting at a bus stop. 8 more individuals came forward independent of each other with varying accounts of seeing Mistie over the weekend. 3 of these people were students from the school Mistie attended who saw her in Goderich, including one witness who said they saw Mistie in a store and had a conversation with her. During the time of all of this, Clinton was having a county fair, and 2 of the people who identified Mistie were carnival workers who were so certain they had seen Mistie. The reason why they were so convinced it was her was because they remembered Mistie and her friends being very drunk. And so the carnival workers told Mistie she couldn't get on the ride that they were operating. And then came the sightings in London, Ontario. Good old London, my hometown. Somehow, the media had reported that Mistie had been seen in London, which got back to Stephen and Anne Murray. When Anne confronted police, they admitted, yeah, there had been sightings. The sightings were as follows. There were 6 independent sightings by London residents who called in tips indicating they'd seen Mistie within 2 weeks of her disappearance. One of the sightings was by a man who said a female resembling Mistie asked him for change at a bus stop. One sighting was by a woman who claimed she'd talked to a female that she believed was Mistie at a local mall, and the woman said Mistie had been crying. Multiple sightings put Mistie in a pretty bad part of London, where she was observed as being strung out or high on crack and working as a sex worker on the streets. Goderich police did follow up on this. They drove to London in mid-June 1995 to investigate these sightings, but very little came of this because there was no movement in the case. Stephen traveled to London and spent a week there in the summer of 1995, searching desperately for Mistie, but never found her. In 1996, Anne, who was resolved to do her own investigating and hadn't given up hope that Mistie would be found, went to London herself, and she went to the seedy area of town that Mistie was supposedly seen in, and she spoke to people in the area. Her investigative efforts provided evidence because she walked away from that experience with about a dozen sworn affidavits from many different kinds of people who said they had seen Mistie, but they had never been formally interviewed by police regarding their tips. So even though they came forward with their tips, police didn't follow up. Ultimately, though, the tips led to a dead end. Mistie Murray is still missing. Now, just shy of 30 years later, Mistie is still considered missing. In November of 2000, Anne and Stephen held a memorial service for Mistie as an attempt at some kind of closure. But they'll never give up looking for Mistie. Mistie Murray is a white female standing approximately 5'4" tall, with gray-green eyes, a gap between her 2 upper front teeth, and a mole on her right cheek. At the time of her disappearance, she had short reddish-brown hair and weighed approximately 115 pounds. She had 5 piercings in her right ear and 2 in her left, but was not wearing any earrings at all the day she disappeared. Mistie may use or have used in the past the names Oldfield and or Kidd. She was also said to have used her birth name, Jean Marie Oldfield. Mistie would be 46 years old today. If you have any information at all about the disappearance or current whereabouts of Mistie Murray, please contact the Ontario Provincial Police at 1-888-310-1122, your local police service, or Crime Stoppers anonymously at 1-800-222-8477. There is a $50,000 reward for information leading to the location of Mistie Murray. Well, squad, that's going to do it for this episode of Crime Squad Podcast. Thanks for listening. What do you think happened to Mistie? Be sure to leave a comment via social media regarding what your theories are. As always, if there is a case you want me to cover, please don't hesitate to slide into my DMs or send me an email. Stay tuned for bonus content, and your next full episode will be out next month. And as always, squad, stay safe and be kind to each other.